So if you have your Bibles, and I hope you do this morning, I'd invite you to turn to Esther chapter. We're going to cover a lot this morning. Chapter 5, 6, and 7. So that means we're certainly not going to read every verse. We're going to tell a lot of the story and refer to some of it. But if you go ahead and turn there to Esther, go ahead and turn to Esther 6, because that's where when we get to reading, that's where we'll jump in. Now, if you're just joining this series, Esther is one of those books in the Bible that you really don't hear a lot about. It's not one that gets preached on very often. It's not one that you read a whole lot. But we've seen over the last 3 weeks, this is our 4th week in the series, that it's an amazing book because of the vision that it gives us of who God is. And there's some strong challenges for us in our lives as well. Now, to give you the really quick summary of how we've gotten to this point, Esther is a Jewish girl, an orphan, living in the capital city of Susa. She was raised by her cousin Mordecai. Well, King Xerxes found himself looking for a new wife because his wife Vashti did not want to join his party when invited. So she was deposed, and after this empire-wide search, Esther, the Jewish orphan, was elevated to be queen. Now, she was raised by Mordecai. The bad guy in the story is a guy named Haman. Haman could not stand Mordecai or all the Jews as far as that's concerned. So when Mordecai refused to bow and show honor to Haman, he came up with his evil plot, not only to destroy Mordecai, but all of the Jews across the Persian Empire, which included Jerusalem, where they're currently, at that time, rebuilding the temple under Zerubbabel. So something had to be done. And last week we saw that Mordecai communicated with Esther back and forth about maybe God has placed you as queen for such a time as this. And though she was hesitant at first, she eventually said, "If I perish, I perish." She chose to risk herself to save the lives of others. And that's where we find ourselves now. Esther has decided, I'm going to take this bold step and go before the king. But I want to tell this story a little differently. I want us to imagine that we're at the end of chapter 5. Those events have transpired. Esther has gone before the king and all these things have happened. And we see our 4 principal characters: Esther, Mordecai, Haman, and Xerxes. And I want you to imagine each of them trying to go to sleep that night after Esther chapter 5. Okay? And I want to start with Esther. You see, Esther, she might have had a hard time going to sleep because she's a little relieved, but she's also anxious. Let me explain. She's relieved because she knew that for her to go before the king uninvited risked certain death. Unless the king would extend his golden scepter, you would be killed if you came into the king's presence unannounced. But she knew this is what it took to save God's people. So that morning she had decided she was going to do this. She had called for a fast. She had fasted for 3 days along with her attendants, and Jews throughout Susa were fasting along with her. And that morning she got up, she made herself beautiful. And Esther was gorgeous. She made herself beautiful. She puts on her royal robes to come into the king's presence. And she was so relieved when he extended the golden scepter. Not only did he extend the scepter to her, but he said, "What is your wish? And what is your petition? If you ask for even up to half the kingdom, it'll be yours." Now that's more of a figure of speech than actually offering her half the kingdom, but it's his way of saying, whatever you want, it's yours. So her request was simple. "I would like the king and Haman to come to a feast that I've prepared. Now we know from the book of Esther, Xerxes likes to eat, and he really likes to drink wine. So he said, that's a great idea. Let's go now. So they rushed off to this banquet. After they've eaten the wonderful food, and now they're drinking the wine, and Xerxes says again, "What is your wish? What is your request? Up to half the kingdom, it will be given to you." Well, for whatever reason, the timing wasn't right. So Esther just said, "Here's my wish. Here's my request. Let's do this again tomorrow. I would like you two to come to another feast tomorrow." And they said, "That sounds like a great idea. Let's do that." So as Esther is laying her head on her pillow that night, she's relieved that she went before the king and she's still breathing. But she's also anxious because she knows that tomorrow is the day that she has to deliver the message, to plead for the life of her people, for her own life as well. But that the lives of the Jews would be saved. So she's probably thinking, okay, what should I serve? Which wine should I choose? And how am I going to say this in such a way that King Xerxes would show favor to the Jews? Speaking of the Jews, I think of Mordecai. He was anxious as well. You see, it was Mordecai's idea to send his cousin, who he raised as his own daughter, to go before King Xerxes, to risk her life. She called for a fast, so he gathered a bunch of people, and they had been fasting for 3 days, but now it was the 4th day. He knew that this was the day that Esther was to go before King Xerxes. We don't know if Mordecai knew anything about what was going on. Was he laying in bed wondering, is Esther still alive? How is this? Is the plan working out? What's happening? All he knew is that later in the day, Haman came skipping out of the palace with a big smile on his face, happier than he had ever seen Haman before. And everyone else stood and bowed their heads in honor, but Mordecai, he's not going to do that. He glares at him. He says, you're the despicable guy that wants to kill me and all of God's people. I'm not going to show you any honor to Haman. So Mordecai, who was always at the king's gate, was there when he saw Haman go by. Now, speaking of Haman, if he had a hard time sleeping that night, it's not because he was anxious. He was excited. I mean, the next day was going to be the best day ever. You see, out of all the people, 3 million square miles of Persian Empire, he was the only one who was invited to this feast with Xerxes and Esther. And he ate the food, he enjoyed the wine. It was a great time together. And if that wasn't enough, Esther said, let's do this again tomorrow. And out of all the people in the empire, he was the only one who was invited to this feast with Esther and Xerxes. So as he left the palace, he's thinking, look how important I am. And look how much power I am accumulating. I am second in command in the most powerful empire on the face of the planet. And as he's walking out of the palace, everyone stands up and he's like, I really love my life. I walk across the room and people stand up and bow down before me. This is great. But then he saw Mordecai, the Jew. Oh, and it just was eating him up on the inside. As a matter of fact, he got home, he gathered his wife, his family, his friends, and he called to them and said, look what I have. I am probably the wealthiest man in Susa. I have great wealth and treasures. People stand up and bow before me when I walk. I have so much power and authority, but there's one thing that drives me crazy. That Jew, Mordecai. As long as he's there refusing to bow, I just can't handle it. And I think his wife and others said, honey, are you listening to yourself? You're talking about all this power you have, and then this guy's driving you crazy. You see, he had set this edict that in the 12th month, all the Jews would be killed. And it is somewhere around the 3rd month at this point. So he said, I still have to wait 8 or 9 months of this guy. And they said, no, you don't. If you have this much power, why don't you just have him executed? And Haman said, what a great idea. I have the power to do this. I have the authority to do this. Let's build gallows, not just normal gallows. Let's make them 50 cubits. This is 75 feet high. I want him way up there so that everyone will see you don't cross Haman. Now we need to understand when we read gallows, you know, we think the Old West, right? The rope hanging down and the trap door. That's not the Persian Empire. It was actually much more gruesome than that. This was most likely a really tall pole on which people were impaled. And it was something that was normally used with like people that had fallen in battle. Like you go defeat an enemy, you may drag some of the dead bodies of these soldiers back and impale them as a public sign of humiliation. This is what Haman's plan was for Mordecai. And as he's going to bed that night, he's thinking, man, tomorrow's going to be the best day ever. Mordecai is going to be hanging on those gallows. I'm going to have this feast with Esther and Xerxes. Morning cannot get here soon enough. Well, speaking of Xerxes, of all of our four characters, he's the one that probably should have just gone right to sleep. I mean, he's not anxious about, are my people going to be exterminated? Am I going to die tomorrow? Well, neither is he like giddy with excitement of, I can't wait to see what tomorrow is going to bring. He should have been the one that just had this great feast with Esther and Haman and then could lay down at night and go to sleep. But what we're going to see when we get into the next chapter is that on the very threshold of the Jewish people being exterminated and annihilated, we begin to see God, the mighty king. Remember, throughout Esther, there's a mighty king, but his name is not Xerxes. It's God in heaven. We begin to see him prove his faithfulness to his people. And he begins to work through acts of providence that can only be explained by the hand of God. The name of God is not found in the book of Esther, but his fingerprints are on every page, especially chapter 6 and into chapter 7. And God's plan to deliver his people all began with one sleepless night from King Xerxes. Now, we've all been there. Those nights you can't sleep. You toss and you turn. This is what Xerxes is doing. I don't know what you do in that moment. It could be you start playing games on your phone, hoping it'll put you back to sleep when every study has shown that looking at screens keeps you awake, not put you to sleep. Just throw that out there. Or maybe you try something that might be more productive, like you read a book, you count sheep. I've never actually done that, but people talk about it. Maybe you pray. I've done that before. It's like, well, I can't sleep, so I'll just start praying for people. And either A, I'll go to sleep, or B, a lot of people will get prayed for, right? And so, well, whatever your strategy is, I do something to put myself back to sleep. Well, Xerxes had a brilliant plan. I'm going to have someone read me a history book. Because what in the world could be more boring than a history book? Well, it's not just a history book. It's the Chronicles of the King. So imagine that, a king is sitting there on his throne. Anytime he does something, there's a guy sitting on the side that writes down, the king sneezed. The king, whatever happened. He's writing down all the acts of the king. And you can imagine how boring that would be to have read. So Xerxes has this idea. Let's just get one of the eunuchs to come read for me the Chronicles, the acts of the kings. And I can just imagine they're waking this guy up. And he's like, hey, wake up. The king wants you to go read the Chronicles to him. And he's like, dude, it's like 4 a.m. Do you really want to not come when the king summons? Does the name Vashti mean anything to you? Okay, I'll come. So he gets up, and, for the sake of modernizing, we'll say it was a book. It could have been scrolls, could have been parchments, we don't know. But it doesn't matter what he reads, where he starts. I mean, the purpose of this is pretty much to put the king back to sleep, right? So he does one of these, plop the book open, let's read here. Okay, once again, remember, fingerprints of God all over the place, because when he starts reading, he just happened to read about an incident that happened 5 years ago. And as he's reading through the events of the day, he said, oh, and there was this one time when these two eunuchs wanted to assassinate King Xerxes, but their plot was thwarted by Mordecai. We saw this in chapter 2, and you read it, and it almost seems out of place. You get to the end of chapter 2. Oh, by the way, Mordecai foiled this plot, and then the story goes on. Well, now we see when you get to chapter 6, this story comes up again. And the king, instead of dozing off to sleep, this was a jolt. He woke up and said, wait a minute. What did we do to reward Mordecai the Jew for saving my life? You see, it was a big deal to save the life of a king. Historians tell us that under King Xerxes, there was a man who saved the life of Xerxes' brother, and so he made him a governor over a province. So if that happens, if you save the life of a brother, what happens if you save the life of the king himself? So it's like, we need to honor this guy. The fingerprints of God are everywhere. Because at that time, someone comes into the palace. And so one of the guards brings word that, hey, there's someone in the courtyard. And can you guess who's in the palace? It's none other than the guy who morning could not come soon enough. It's Haman, starting the best day ever. You see, he probably woke up earlier than usual and thought, man, I love today. Mordecai is going to die. I get to go to a feast with Xerxes and Esther. He's probably skipping his way to the palace that morning, singing that age-old wonderful hymn, zippity-doo-dah, zippity-yay, my, oh my, what a wonderful day. And as he comes to the palace, he sees, hello, little people, good to see you here this morning. Was Mordecai already there that early? I don't know. But I can just imagine Haman singing zippity-doo-dah, and then Haman, nice to see you, hanging around this morning. This is great. The best day ever. And he's probably thinking, what will the king's gate be like without Mordecai? It'll be amazing. Have you seen Mordecai today? Where's Mordecai? That's right. He's on a pole 75 feet up in the air. He's not here. He's so excited about what's going to happen today. His enemy is going to be gone. And so as he comes skipping in to the palace, he has one thing in mind. I get to come before Xerxes and say, Mordecai has got to go. We have gallows. He's not showing honor and respect. He needs to be hanged. So he comes into the king's presence. But before he can get these words out of his mouth that we need to kill Mordecai, the king speaks first. And I want you to notice what he says. In chapter 6 and verse 8. I'm sorry, I think it's verse 6. Really small letters here. Verse 6, numbers. So Haman came in, and the king said to him, what should be done to the man whom the king delights to honor? And Haman said to himself, whom would the king delight? Whom would the king delight to honor more than me? I mean, this is irony that only can come about through the hand of God's providence. That the king is saying, I want to do something really nice for Mordecai. And Haman is thinking, hey, king wants to do something really nice for me. So look what he goes on to say. Haman said to the king, for the man whom the king delights to honor, let royal robes be brought. Not just anyone's, but the ones that the king has actually worn. And the horse that the king has ridden. Not only that, but on whose head put the royal crown. And let the robes and the horse be handed over to one of the king's most noble officials. Let them dress the man whom the king delights to honor, and let them lead him on the horse through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. You know, something about that seems like a strange request. I mean, Xerxes, in Haman's mind, the king wants to do something really nice for me. It's a blank check. And he's thinking, I got all the money I need. I don't want more money. I don't want to be like governor of some province. You know what I want more than anything? I want people to see and know that I am great. I want to know what it feels like to be king and have everybody bow before me. I want to bask in my own greatness. That's what I want more than anything. Well, you can imagine how his heart must have sunk when the king responds in verse 10. Then the king said to Haman, hurry, take the robes and the horse, as you have just said, and do so to Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Leave out nothing that you have mentioned. So Haman took the robes and the horse, and he dressed Mordecai and led him through the square of the city, proclaiming before him, thus shall it be done to the man whom the king delights to honor. What a reversal! This best day ever was not turning out quite the way Haman had planned. How humiliating that must have been to take this man that you despise, this man that you wanted to have executed, this man who just a couple of days ago was wearing goat hair and ashes, the sackcloth and ashes as a sign of mourning, and instead you are dressing him. You're putting the king's robe on, and the crown itself. I mean, you may have said, Mordecai, you got a few ashes left in your hair. Let me wipe that out before we put the crown on you. And then Mordecai, who just a few days earlier was walking through the streets of the city, weeping and wailing and mourning, instead is riding on the king's horse, wearing the crown and the king's robe with the second most powerful person in the kingdom, saying this is what happens to the guy that the king delights to honor. It was a reversal. Kind of a lifting up of Mordecai and a humiliation of Haman. As a matter of fact, this could not be done soon enough for Haman. He was finished. He made a beeline, covered his face, ran home, gathered his wife, his family, and his friends and said, "You will not believe how bad this day is going. Listen to what I had to do." And they had great words of comfort for him. They said, "You will not stand before Mordecai the Jew. You're probably going to die," is what they told him. Comforting words to hear when you've just been humiliated. Suddenly there's a knock on the door, an ominous knock on the door. It's one of the king's eunuchs saying, "The banquet is ready. Come join Esther and Xerxes." We see through this the hand of God. We see that God's people were threatened, about to be annihilated, exterminated. But then God is at work. It's intriguing to me that our four main characters all had reasons to have a hard time sleeping. But it's the one who never sleeps and never slumbers that orchestrates this delightfully ironic plan to deliver his people. And you see, sometimes God works through handwriting on the walls and signs and wonders and plagues and floods and dramatic things. But so many more times he works through simple providence, orchestrating things in such a way that it reminds us that not only is God the mighty king who's sovereign and reigning over all, but he's the mighty king who's faithful to us. And so many times things just happen. A coincidence. Things like the king just happens to not be able to sleep, and they just happen to read the story of Mordecai, and Haman just happens to walk into the palace at just the right time. Where you look at those, you can't say that just happened. That was God, the mighty king, at work on behalf of his people through his providence. And understand this for us today, that even when things seem hopeless and dark and desperate, they're never hopeless and completely dark and completely desperate, because we too have a mighty king who shows faithfulness to his people. And he's faithful to his people so many times through his providence. By the way, he also shows his faithfulness, and we're going to see this. He demonstrates his faithfulness through providence, but also through his people. And God brings people into our lives who may just say something encouraging, or someone to pray for you, or someone to walk beside you at just the right time, and you just kind of realize, that was a gift from God. He's showing his faithfulness to me. I saw this a couple of weeks ago. I had a book I wanted to read for a class I'm taking, and so I kind of needed to get this done. So I had this plan. I'm going to go out to lunch, get a table by myself, and open my book and get all the refills of Diet Coke I want. And I wanted fast food. So I'm choosing, where do I want to go? Do I want to go to Wendy's or Baker's or Carl's Jr.? Where am I going to go? And so I ended up at Carl's Jr., but then I have the choice, which one do I go to? So I drive down to Highland Springs, end up at Carl's Jr. to have this quiet lunch by myself. Well, wouldn't you know, two people behind me is an old friend that I haven't seen in a while. And he asked me, "Hey, Mark, Are you here by yourself? Everything inside of me said, no, I'm here with a book. But I said, yeah, I'm here. But he said, great, I'll have lunch with you. I was like, yay. And so we sit down and start having lunch, and about a third of the way into the conversation, he starts asking some questions. Asking questions in a way that just was caring for my soul. And I started realizing, this just might have been of God. I could have chosen all, and actually our conversation started was, I almost went to this place or this place, but really, I went through the same thing. So we talked about how we just happened to end up at this same Carl's Jr. And then as he started talking, I found my soul being encouraged, and I thought, what a gift from God. The God, the mighty King, who shows faithfulness to His people, will work in such small ways as us ending up at the same restaurant, through providence ending up at the same restaurant. But then He worked through a person to communicate. You see how this works? Well, sometimes God does the big and dramatic, but He often works through providence or people. And this is what we see in Esther. We see God's hand of providence in orchestrating all these events, but when you get to chapter 7, God works through a person. You see, they gather for this banquet, this feast. They had this great food, which they like a lot. They had plenty of wine, which they like a lot. And then King Xerxes, for the third time, looks at Esther. And it's Esther's turn to be used by God, for God to demonstrate His faithfulness to His people by working through a person. He asked this question a third time. What is your wish? What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it will be done for you. So Esther responds, let me tell you my wish. Let me tell you my request. In chapter 7, let's look at verse 3. Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor in your sight, O king, and if it please the king, let my life be granted for my wish, and my people for my request. That's my wish and my request. For we have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, to be killed, and to be annihilated. If we had been sold merely as slaves, men and women, I would have been silent, for our affliction is not to be compared with the loss of the king. Well, what she's saying there is, if it was just selling the adults into slavery, I wouldn't bother you with this, King Xerxes. But it's not just selling the adults into slavery, it is annihilating man, woman, boy, girl, the entire race to be wiped out. So I'm coming before you, because I don't know where else to go. And then the king responds. King Ahasuerus, which is the Hebrew name, but he's known more as King Xerxes, said to Queen Esther, who is he and where is he who dared to do this? And Esther said, a foe and an enemy, this wicked Haman. And Haman was terrified before the king and the queen. Now, the English Bible doesn't really capture the emotion and the rage in Xerxes' voice. He's using short syllables. Do you remember, did you ever make your mother so mad she spoke to you in syllables? I told you to clean your room and you go. Maybe you never dealt with that. I can say I did because my mother's not here this morning. This is the tone of Xerxes. Who is he? Where is he? Who has done this evil thing? That's his tone. And Esther responds with the same rage. A foe and an enemy, this evil, wicked Haman. Well, we read at that point, the king, in his fury, just ran out of the room into the gardens. And by the way, he's found himself in a bit of a predicament, because his edict was Haman's idea. But guess who signed off on it? So he's out there thinking, I can't believe Haman did this, and he used me. Now what am I going to... And what we know from Xerxes, he never really comes up with decisions on his own anyway. He's always asking, what should I do? He's always asking these things. Haman knew that. So Haman pleads for his life with Esther, which is ironic because the whole purpose of this is for Esther to plead for her life. And it ends with Haman pleading with Esther for his life. And as a matter of fact, he even came and fell on the couch where she was sitting, begging for his life. And at the moment that he fell on the couch, Xerxes comes storming back into the room, seeing Haman falling on the couch. You don't come this close to the queen. And he looked and said, really? You're going to assault my queen in my house? This was a way out for Xerxes. How can I execute this man for signing a law that I agreed to? Oh, but I can execute him for assaulting the queen. And immediately, his head was covered. And one of the eunuchs nearby said, hey, I saw some gallows today. Right next to Haman's house. How convenient. 75 feet up in the air. Haman was killed on the gallows that were erected out of his pride. What a reversal. When you look in chapter 8, all of the treasures, this great wealth of Haman, was given to Esther. And what does she do with it? She gives it to Mordecai. What a reversal. Mordecai, who a few days ago was walking the streets in goat hair and ashes, weeping and wailing, is now one of the wealthiest men in Susa. And we'll see as the book goes on, becomes one of the most influential men in the Persian Empire. And Haman. This was going to be zippity-doo-dah, the best day ever, that turned into a terrible, horrible, no good, very bad day. Now, as we go through this story, we see kind of these two streams running through it. One stream is that God is the mighty king who acts through providence and his people to prove his faithfulness, to show his faithfulness to his people. And we delight in this. I mean, you read this story and say, isn't that just God? Isn't that just something he would do? This great reversal. This word of encouragement that came from an unexpected place. Isn't that just how God works? Doing just what we need at just the right time. And you have this stream that just says, look at God. He's mighty. He's the king. He's faithful. Just delight in who he is. But then you have this other stream that's more of a warning. You see, we look at this character of Haman and we think, what is this passage telling us through the enemy, the antagonist in this? And you realize, watch out for pride. Everything about Haman, this godless Haman, screamed, pride, look at me. When you can have whatever you want, what do I want? I want everyone to bow before me and see how great I am. That's my desire. And it's the pride that led to his downfall. To be killed on the gallows that were erected really by his pride. He is the personification of Proverbs 16:18 that says pride comes before destruction and a haughty spirit comes before a fall. Haman is not the great man. God is great. He's the mighty king who's faithful to his people. And guess what? He is opposed to the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And deep inside each of us is something we need to keep watch on, and that is that we guard ourselves from pride. C.S. Lewis said something to the fact of Satan is very happy to give us victory over things like lust and envy and these things if he can set up within us the kingdom of pride. It's the original sin. It's a horrible sin. And we look at Haman and see where pride takes us. And I think these two streams kind of flow together because what is the secret for living with humility? It's this, recognizing that there's a mighty king and it's not me. that I'm part of God's plan, but He is the mighty King that's faithful to His people. And so I respond with humility. And so I think of those times where maybe God, I'm blessed with something from God. It could be a word of encouragement, could be sometimes correction, it could be even a material blessing, a financial gain, or a gift of some sort. The response to that is not like Haman, what gift do you want? I want people to see how great I am. No, the response is what I want to call a humble delight in God, of recognizing that I'm going to receive this humbly because this is from God, but at the same time I'm going to delight because God knew this is what I needed and He provided for me. Out of my need and out of my weakness, not out of my strength. So I'm going to humbly delight in the God who does this. Or maybe you have an opportunity to be the one that God uses. Maybe you're the friend who speaks the word of encouragement. Maybe God has gifted you as a musician or as a writer or as a carpenter. Maybe God has given you unique abilities, and within that there's a tendency to become proud of the things because of the things that God has given us. When instead we should respond with just a humble delight. This was just something that God gave me so that I can use it for His glory. And I'm humbled by the giftedness, and I delight that God might use me in the life of someone else. It's living with a humble delight. And I think it starts at this point, that the greatest show of humility is seen by God Himself. That Jesus, who existed as God, in the form of exact, by very nature, God, did not hang on to that, but He humbled Himself and became in very nature human. And was obedient as a servant, even to the point of death, even death on the cross, so that we can be forgiven. But do you know how we come to Christ? Do you know how we receive of God? It's through a humble delight. It's through coming and saying, I have a need. I'm guilty as a sinner, and I need a Savior. It takes humility to cry out before God and admit our need. But then there's a delight in knowing that God has lavished His grace upon us through the cross. You see, here's the truth. Each of us should be able to identify with Haman, because what we deserve is to die on the gallows that our sin has created. And the reason that we don't have to be impaled 75 feet up in the air on the gallows that our sin created, is because there was another one that hung, not on gallows, but on a cross, so that we can be forgiven. So we don't have to die our own death because of our sin. We can come humbly before the cross and receive the gift of forgiveness and salvation that comes through what Jesus did on our behalf. That's a humble delight. That I don't get what I deserve. I get what God has provided. And He's a mighty King who is faithful to His people. And my challenge for you this morning is that if you're at that point where maybe you're hearing of this love for the first time, you need to just respond with a humble delight. Yes, God, I need you. And I'm so delighted that you would give your Son for me. Let's pray together. Father, I thank you for your word this morning. This is, on one hand, just actually a funny story if you think about it. But such a message for us. Father, help us to live with this humble delight in who you are. That your gifts would not cause us to be arrogant, but they would continually drive us to our knees. Recognizing we are always needy people that can delight in the hand of God at work in our life. Thank you for how you use both providence and people to show your faithfulness to us. And Father, I pray that if there are people here this morning who have never come to the point of bowing their knees before you, recognizing the truth of what Jesus did on the cross. Father, would you give them the courage to just come humbly before you? And Father, with all the honesty in our hearts, just come and say, God, that I am a sinner. And though I deserve your judgment, though I deserve to die because of my sin, I want to trust in what Jesus did on the cross. And so I ask you to forgive me and to save me and to change me for your glory. And that the same way that you use someone like Esther in all of her weakness, I pray that you would use someone like me with all of my weakness to make a difference for you and for your kingdom. So Father, thank you for your work, for your grace to strengthen us and to save us and to encourage us. You are the God who forgives sinful people, the God who redeems unfaithful people, the God who uses broken and flawed people. And so we come before you humbly, delighting in who you are, the mighty King who is faithful to his people. And we pray this in Jesus' name. Amen.